Everyone in my family said I looked just like my grandmother when she was young. It was our little thing, but they never told me which grandmother. Last month, I found her vintage Leica camera in the attic. The film inside was still good. When I developed it, I saw a face that was my mirror image. A woman I'd never met, standing next to my grandfather in 1972. The date on the back, exactly 9 months before my father was born. The fire I started that night didn't just burn the evidence, it burned my family to the ground. That woman in the photo wasn't my grandmother, and the letter I found taped inside the camera case explained everything. If you're reading this, the cancer has taken me. Everything your family told you is a lie. You need to find your real grandmother, the woman in this photo. Her name is Isabella, and your grandfather buried her alive in the foundation of our family home. Before I continue this story, I would like to remind you to subscribe to this channel if you like these kind of stories. My name is Chloe, and until 3 weeks ago, I believed I came from a perfect, boring family. We were the kind of people who had matching Christmas pajamas and annual family reunions where everyone actually liked each other. Or so I thought. It started when my parents decided to sell our childhood home, the massive Victorian that had been in my grandfather's family for generations. My task was to clean out the attic, a place I'd been forbidden from entering as a child. Just full of junk, my mother always said, too quickly. The attic was a time capsule, dust swirling in the late afternoon light like forgotten memories. And there, sitting on a velvet-lined shelf as if waiting for me, was the camera. A beautiful, brutalist Leica M3. My grandfather's pride and joy, according to the stories. He was a renowned architect, a man of precision and order. The camera suited him. What didn't suit him was what I found next. Taped inside the leather case was a yellowed envelope. Inside, a single roll of film and a note in my grandfather's precise architectural script. Do not develop, destroy. Dear friend, let me ask you a question. If you were me, what would you have done? Destroy it or develop it? Curiosity, that beautiful, treacherous snake, uncoiled in my chest. I'm a photographer. The thought of destroying a perfectly preserved roll of 35 film was sacrilege. That night, in my darkroom, as the images slowly emerged in the developer tray, my heart began to race. The first few shots were what you'd expect, architectural studies of the house during construction. But then, a portrait. A woman with wild, dark hair and laughing eyes, her features so strikingly similar to mine it was like looking into a warped mirror. She was leaning against a half-built wall, smiling at the photographer with an intimacy that made my breath catch. My grandfather must have taken the photo. The next frame showed the same woman, Isabella, according to a note on the back, standing with my grandfather. His arm was wrapped around her, his face relaxed in a way I'd never seen in any family photo. The date scrawled on the back, January 18, 1972. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling. I Googled my father's birthday. September 16, 1972. Exactly 9 months later. The math was like a sledgehammer to my soul. This woman, Isabella, wasn't just my grandfather's secret. She was my father's biological mother. The woman I knew as my grandmother, Eleanor, the cold, elegant woman who died of breast cancer years ago, wasn't related to me by blood. I spent the rest of the night in a frantic digital deep dive. I searched property records, old newspapers, anything I could find about an Isabella connected to my grandfather. Nothing. It was like she'd vanished. The next morning, sleep-deprived and desperate, I went back to the attic. There had to be more. I ran my hands over the floorboards, the walls, until my fingers caught on a nearly invisible seam in the pine paneling. A hidden compartment. Inside was a small, metal lockbox. The key was hanging on a nail behind it. My hands shook so badly I could barely fit it into the lock. The box contained 3 things. A stack of love letters from my grandfather to Isabella, filled with passionate promises and detailed plans to leave his wife. A final, frantic letter from Isabella, dated July 1972. Robert, I'm pregnant. Eleanor knows. She came to see me today. She said such terrible things. She said she'd make sure you never believed the child was yours. I'm scared. and a faded, crumbling newspaper clipping from August 1972 with a single paragraph circled in red ink. Missing person, Isabella Rossi, 22, an art student. Last seen near the West End construction site. Police suspect foul play. The West End construction site, the one my grandfather was building, our family home. The pieces clicked together with terrifying, brutal logic. My grandfather had an affair. His wife, Elena, found out. Isabella disappeared, and my grandfather raised her son as his own with a woman who may have driven his real mother to her death, or worse. I stumbled down from the attic, the world tilting on its axis. I found my father in the kitchen, drinking coffee and reading the paper, blissfully unaware that his entire life was a lie. "Dad," I said, my voice strangled, "who is Isabella Rossi?" The cup slipped from his hand, shattering on the tile floor. The look on his face, not confusion but pure, unadulterated panic, told me everything I needed to know. He knew. He had always known. The pieces clicked together with terrifying, brutal logic. My grandfather had an affair. His wife, Elena, found out. Isabella disappeared, and my grandfather raised her son as his own with a woman who may have driven his real mother to her death, or worse. The color drained from my father's face so completely I thought he might pass out. He didn't answer my question. Instead, his eyes darted toward the hallway, a gesture of pure animal fear. He stood up, closed the study door softly, and turned to me. The genial, somewhat distant father I knew was gone, replaced by a terrified, cornered man. "Where did you get that?" he whispered, his voice cracking. He was staring at the lockbox as if it were a venomous snake. "I found it," I said, my own fear now mingling with a fierce, protective anger for the woman in the photo. "Who was she?" "The police thought she was murdered, Dad, at Grandpa's construction site." He sank back into his chair, his head in his hands. For a long time, the only sound was the ponderous ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. When he finally spoke, his voice was muffled by his palms. "The official story," he began, reciting words he'd clearly learned by heart, "is that Isabella was unstable, that she had episodes. She had a fight with my father and ran off. He, being a good man, took me in when I was born. Elena, being a saint, agreed to raise me as her own." I placed the newspaper clipping on his desk. "Foul play is suspected," I read aloud, tapping the words. "This doesn't sound like a woman who just ran off. And this," I said, laying Isabella's terrified letter next to it. "She was scared of Elena. She threatened her with a bottle of something." My father flinched as if I'd struck him. "You don't understand the pressure they were under, the scandal. He was building his reputation, Elena's family. They were powerful. They could have destroyed him. So they destroyed Isabella instead." The words hung in the air, ugly and final. "Get rid of it, Chloe," he pleaded, his eyes desperate. "Burn the letters, destroy the film. Forget you ever saw any of this, for your own good. You're digging in a grave, and you have no idea what's buried down there with her." His warning was a splash of cold water. It wasn't a denial. It was a confirmation that the grave was real, and that I was getting too close to it. I left the study, my mind reeling. My own father was complicit in this 50-year cover-up. His fear didn't extinguish my curiosity. It poured gasoline on it. I became a detective on my own family's cold case. I went to the city planning department and requested the original blueprints for the Victorian. The clerk handed me a large, crisp roll of paper. The official plans were meticulous, signed and stamped by Robert Blackwood, architect. I studied them for an hour, cross-referencing every measurement, every notation. Nothing. But I remembered the hand-drawn sketches in my grandfather's personal files. I went back to the attic, to the trunk where I'd found the camera. Beneath a stack of old accounting ledgers, I found a leather-bound portfolio. Inside were the early conceptual sketches. They were fluid, expressive, a far cry from the technical precision of the final blueprints. And there, on a sketch of the foundation, was a small, rectangular chamber drawn beside the main support beam. It was unlabeled. And it had been violently scribbled out, the pencil lead gouging the paper. A cold dread, colder than the attic air, seeped into my bones. "Your grandfather buried her alive in the foundation." The note from the camera case echoed in my mind. It wasn't meant to be literal. But what if it was? What if he hadn't buried her body, but her remains? That night, the house was silent. My parents had gone to bed, but the air was thick with unspoken accusations. I waited until midnight, then I crept down to the basement. It was a place I'd always hated as a child, a damp, cavernous space with a low ceiling and the constant, distant rumble of the furnace. I found the main support beam exactly where the sketch indicated. The concrete floor in front of it was seamless, except for one area about 3 feet by 3 feet, where the texture was slightly rougher, the color a shade lighter. It was a patch job. A professional one, but a patch job nonetheless. I'd brought a heavy-duty flashlight and my phone. I also brought a crowbar and a small sledgehammer from the garage. My hands were slick with sweat. I was about to vandalize my family home, a historical landmark based on a half-century-old hunch. I started with the crowbar, jamming it into the hairline crack at the edge of the patch. The concrete was old and brittle. A large chunk broke away with a loud crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silence. I froze, listening. No sound from upstairs. I worked faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The sledgehammer made short work of the rest. Soon, I had cleared a hole large enough to see into the cavity behind it. It wasn't just a foundation wall. It was a recess, a deliberately created space. And inside that space was an object. It wasn't a body, it was an urn. A beautiful, hand-thrown ceramic urn, glazed in deep blues and greens, reminiscent of the ocean. It was sealed with a lead plug. Tied around its neck with a frayed, rotting ribbon was a single sheet of paper. My hands trembled as I untied it. The writing was my grandfather's, but it was shaky, written under unimaginable duress. My dearest Isabella, I failed you. I was too weak to stand up to a leaner. I let her poison you, and I was too much a coward to call the police. I cannot bring you back, but I can keep you close. I will build our house around you so a part of you will always be with me. Forgive me. R. She hadn't been buried alive. A leaner had poisoned her. My grandfather had found her, and instead of going to the authorities, he had entombed her in the very foundation of his legacy, his guilt literally cementing her into the bones of our home. He'd lived his entire life in this house, raising their son, with the ashes of the woman he loved and failed hidden beneath his feet. I fell to my knees, the sledgehammer clattering to the floor. The horror of it was suffocating. This house wasn't a home. It was a mausoleum. My entire life had been built on a literal grave. I heard a floorboard creak above me. I looked up to see my mother standing at the top of the basement stairs, her face a mask of cold fury. She wasn't holding a sledgehammer. She was holding the vintage Leica camera. I told your father you were too much like her, she said, her voice dangerously calm. Too curious, too sentimental. She raised the camera, and with a cruel smile, she let it drop. It shattered on the concrete steps, the beautiful lens exploding into 1,000 glittering shards. The past should stay buried, Chloe, she said, turning away. For your own good. But it was too late. The past was already dug up, and it was staring at me from the ornate urn in my hands. Holding the ashes of the grandmother I never knew, in the basement of the house she was murdered in, I understood true terror. It wasn't a jump scare. It was the slow, chilling realization that the people who raised you are capable of monstrous things. My mother's threat wasn't subtle. I was a loose end, just like Isabella. I took the urn, packed a bag, and left that night. I checked into a motel under a fake name, the urn sitting on the cheap nightstand like a sacred, terrifying relic. I couldn't go to the police. What would I say? My grandfather, a pillar of the community, hid his mistress's ashes in the foundation 50 years ago, and my mother might be an accessory after the fact. It was a gothic nightmare, not a police report. I had no proof of the poisoning, only a cryptic note. My only lead was Isabella herself. I spent days in the motel room, scouring the internet for any trace of her family. I found an obituary for her parents. They died years ago, predeceased by their daughter, Isabella. But I also found a name, Lorenzo Rossi, her younger brother. He was harder to find. He'd changed his last name, but a trail of property records and a single old professional listing led me to a small coastal town 3 hours away. A Lorenzo Ross, a retired fisherman. I drove there the next day, the urn carefully wrapped in a blanket on the passenger seat. I found him on a dock, mending a net, his face weathered by sun and salt. When I approached and said, "Are you Lorenzo Rossi?" his hands stilled. When I told him who I was and showed him the urn and the note, the tough old man crumpled. He wept for the sister he'd spent 50 years searching for. "She was so bright," he told me, his voice rough with grief. "So full of life. When she disappeared, the police did nothing. They believed your grandfather's story about her being unstable. It broke my parents. It broke me." He had his own box of memories, photos of a vibrant, smiling Isabella, her childhood drawings, and one crucial piece of evidence I didn't have, a diary she'd kept during the affair. The final entry, written the day she died, was explicit. "Eleanor confronted me today. She said if I didn't leave Robert alone, she'd make me disappear. She showed me a bottle of something in her purse. I told her I was pregnant. She just smiled and said, 'We'll see.'" It was enough. With Lorenzo by my side, I went to the police. Not the local force, but the State Bureau of Investigation. We presented everything. The urn, the blueprint, my grandfather's confession note, Isabella's diary. It was a 50-year-old cold case, but the evidence was undeniable. The story exploded. The perfect family was front-page news. My father was never charged, but his complicity through silence cost him his career, his reputation, and me. The culprit had long died, but the perfect family name, the reputation, was utterly destroyed. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to. The truth was no longer buried. Lorenzo and I took Isabella's ashes to the coast, to the place she'd loved as a child. We scattered them into the sea at sunrise. It was the funeral she never had. The family house was sold. The new owners planned to demolish it and build something new. I hoped they would. Some foundations are too poisoned to build upon. My father tried to reach out to explain his cowardice, but I couldn't forgive him. Some truths don't set you free. They just show you the bars of your cage. I have a new family now, Lorenzo, who tells me stories about the grandmother whose spirit I inherited, and a quiet life by the ocean. I learned that the past isn't something you escape. It's something you carry. And sometimes, the heaviest things to carry are the truths you had to dig up with your own 2 hands. Dear friend, I ask again, if you were the one who found out about this ancient secret, what would you have done?